Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And before we start, I would like to pay particular tribute to you and the incredible work you've been doing over the years, both as a soldier and after you left, fighting the political battles around the defense of Israel. And I think it's also a real honor to be here, taking part in my first, I know it's not the first, but my first event for the MirYam Institute, which I've read a lot about it. I'm beginning to understand it, and I think it's an incredible organization that deserves a huge amount of support.
Thank you so very much. And in that vein, I'd also like to thank who are with me and who are able to ensure that all that we do is possible. And first, without equals, I thank Rosita Panini, who's our Chief Operations Officer. And of course, you know Rosita from the work that we've undertaken across several years. And also Alan Langer, my great and powerful colleague, who's responsible for this connection here that we have today. So thank you for your kind words, Richard. And before I get going, I just want to establish some parameters for everybody watching. You've been gracious enough to give us about an hour of your time. I'll interview you for about 40, maybe even 45 minutes, but it's more a conversation than an interview, because we have had, at least I've had the pleasure of getting to know you. I don't know if you'd say the opposite is true over the past few years. And then after I've spoken to you, we're going to take some questions from the audience, and they've come actually from all over the world, from servicemen and women to captains of business and industry and so forth. So that's how we're going to try and work this. And before I really launch into the subject of today's conversation, tell me a little bit about where you are in the UK. What's the situation in the shadow of COVID-19?
Well, before I answer that, I would also like to say my thanks to everybody from countries in different parts of the world who have dialed into this conference. And I know that a lot of them come from the United States, a lot from here in Britain, where it's actually quite late, and even some from Israel, where it's even later. And also, I'd like to apologize for my appearance. I normally at this time of night would be wearing a dinner jacket and sitting down to a sumptuous 5-course meal, but in deference to the Israeli people here, who I know don't know what a suit is, I thought I'd relax a bit. I'm in southeast England, about an hour and a half outside London, and the situation here is extraordinary, really. I mean, I'm talking about my local situation, because life has really ground to a halt, as it has throughout much of the United Kingdom, or pretty much all of the United Kingdom. But of course, the epicenter of our coronavirus problem over here is London, as I think is New York over in your place. And so far, we've been quite badly hit. We've got a total confirmed number of cases of 33,000 in the UK, which obviously doesn't reflect the true number, because it's only those people who have been tested, which is not a huge amount. And there are almost 3,000 total dead from the disease. And the average death rate here in the UK is around about 500 at the moment. Although it looks now, as some relatively optimistic news coming from the government, it looks as if that's beginning to plateau and may well start turning down within perhaps a few days. So a dire and desperate situation. A lot of people in very tough circumstances, obviously the ones who are infected with the Chinese virus, and those people who have had their lives turned upside down by it, and of course even more so the people that have died from it and will die in the future. But of course, then one of the other problems is the massive economic suffering that this is causing at the moment, with many, many people out of work, and more probably going to be out of work, and a big financial problem for many of them. The government here has intervened, I think, very effectively. Others may disagree with that, but as I see it, it's pretty effective in terms of doing what they can and spending billions of pounds on trying to ease the economic pain for so many people. In terms of their dealing with the virus, I believe that the government is doing a good job from what I've seen of it. I'm not an expert, but as far as I can see, they are. Their tactics started in one way, changed, and are changing again. And one thing that I do find quite annoying in the current situation is the media, the mainstream media, not all of them, most of them, approach to this, where the government changes its position and immediately is criticised for doing a U-turn, or some fault comes out and the government's criticised. And I think the people that are doing the media have found it very hard to adapt to a new situation, which the rest of us have had to adapt to. The media still think they're in pre-coronavirus mode, as opposed to what is effectively wartime mode. Of course, they should criticise the government. That goes without saying. But it's not really the tone they're normally setting is not really the right tone, I don't think, to deal with this current situation. Maybe they'll adjust, maybe they'll adapt as the rest of us have. But otherwise, I think most British people are doing what they're supposed to be doing: social distancing. You're not allowed out of your house except for specific purposes like buying food or going on a walk. You can walk once a day or run, whatever takes your fancy. I walk, I think, at my very ancient stage of life. I'm sure, Benjamin, you'd be sprinting around the block a few times. And you can go food shopping, you can go get medical supplies if you need it, etc. But most people, other than that, are not really allowed out apart from key workers. The armed forces has mobilised 20,000 soldiers to help the NHS deal with this situation. All of them are on standby. Many of them are already deployed, but not a huge number. They're doing things like helping with logistics, emergency planning, and in the last few days they've been doing very active on providing helicopter support around the country for the NHS. And yesterday the government announced it was calling up 3,000 reserves, although those reserves are they're not compulsorily mobilised. If they don't want to go, then they don't have to. The government has a power, which it hasn't used yet, to compulsorily mobilise reserves. So complete upheaval in all our lives. From when I was over in the United States a few weeks ago, I would never have dreamt this situation was going to develop as it has done.
And do you feel, to go back to your comments on the media, first of all, I'm being advised that my reception's a little bit spotty. Can you hear me clearly, Colonel?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Great. So do you feel, going back to your comments about the media rather, that they're causing a panic among the general population? And do you think that they're aware of that? Do you think that that's something that they deliberately whip up?
Well, that was actually a very good point. And it's one of the things that I think they haven't adapted to, because of course the media exists on sensation. That's how you sell papers. That's how you get people to watch television programs, etc. And this is not a time for sensation. This is a time for sober, realistic analysis, questioning, etc. And I think the media have not in every case, but many of them have not really realised that. And so, of course, it does sometimes cause, I wouldn't say panic exactly. It causes increased concern where that concern is not necessary. People are concerned enough as it is.
Well, I know that everybody on this call is very much with the British people at this time and in spirit, and we do hope that they, along with the rest of the world, frankly, do manage to turn a corner and move on to better times. So thank you for telling us a little bit about how that situation looks over there in the UK. I'd like to turn a little bit to your personal story. So we meet you as Colonel Richard Kemp, but you weren't always a colonel. And I just saw on Twitter, and I encourage everybody to follow your Twitter feed, a wonderful photograph that you put out today of you as a young officer, I believe. But there was a time even before that. When did you decide that you wanted to go into the military? As I read your bio, I was struck by the fact that you joined the armed forces the day after you concluded high school. So how did that come to pass?
I left high school one day and joined the army the next day. And I didn't go to university. Frankly, I am not an academic person. I didn't enjoy school, and I certainly would not have enjoyed university, so I didn't do it. I was always going to join the army. I never had any thought from my earliest memories, apart from being a soldier and fighting for the country. My excuse for that is that I never really grew up. I loved playing soldiers when I was a child and never grew out of it. So I naturally went straight in. I was very fortunate to have a 30-year military career and enjoyed, with very few exceptions, pretty much all of it.
Did you go in there with a determination that you would have a career at the outset, or were you just going to try it and see where it developed?
I expected to stay in the army for my life, and I expected to die in battle, as every soldier ultimately wants to, but hopefully not too early. And I So I know I never had any other aspirations, never. And during my time in the army, I never looked sideways. Very rarely thought about doing other things, but it was normally something like joining the French Foreign Legion or something like that, or the Hong Kong Police. But I never seriously looked at other options. I was always going to be a career soldier, and, unless I got cashiered, which I came close to a few times.
Now, just to explain that.
Well,
Explain
you
that
get
term.
court-martialed and fired for misdemeanors or for war crimes or whatever. Didn't commit any war crimes, but I sailed close to the wind quite a bit, and I think like many people, I wasn't rebellious in the army, because you can't be rebellious, but I had my own thoughts. I didn't tend to fit in with groupthink, and my father always said, if you see the crowd going one way, go the other way. That was basically his mantra in life, and I followed that. And in fact, my pretty much almost the happiest, I had very many happy times in the army. One of the happiest was when I was in Afghanistan, because I was the boss out there, and my boss were 3,000 miles away in North London, and often the communications didn't work. So I was able to do and play things pretty much as I wanted to. It's always great not to have a boss and not to have always be able to follow your own instinct, your own experience.
I think that's very true. In fact, Ariel Sharon, the former prime minister of the state of Israel, and indeed a storied commander and hero of the military before that, used to say, "En tachlif leben adam bashetach," which means there's no substitute for a man in the field. You can get all of the commands that you want from HQ and high command, but in the end, the man or the woman in the theater is the individual who knows what's going on. And it sounds like you're very much of the same mindset.
You didn't need to translate that, Benjamin. I'm fluent in Hebrew, or so I tell myself. But I think you raise a very good point, and it's one thing that I've observed over here, which is why I'm quite critical of the media, which is that what they don't really understand, and many other people don't understand as well. Why should they? I think many people in business do, but certainly people in the armed forces. Your people over in Israel, people in the US, people in Britain, in the armed forces, or who've served, recognize that when you're faced with a completely different situation, unexpected, unprepared, effectively, you then have to deal with it as you can, and you make mistakes along the way. You do missteps, you do things wrong, and you then correct them and get on with it. But you shouldn't necessarily be constantly criticized because you weren't perfect. The people that are sitting in the armchairs criticizing our politicians now and our National Health Service now are not people who've had to face this sort of situation before. And I think the army, the armed forces really changes you in that respect. And you recognize that you're sometimes dealing with chaos. And I think the IDF, as well as the British and the American Army, are adept at dealing with chaos, because a battlefield situation is a chaotic situation by definition. Whatever you're trying to do, the enemy is trying to stop you from doing it and kill you while you're doing it. So it's I think military attitude sometimes is different to many civilians' attitudes. I wouldn't say that people in some areas of business are much different to that, because of course they have to adjust and adapt as situations change to keep the bottom line going.
I think that's very true. A lot of people, I know certainly it was the case before I enlisted in Israel Defense Forces, my perception was that the military is regimentation and order and precision. And in actual fact, the military is managing chaos, as you've said. And the military, especially at wartime, in wartime, is becoming a master of innovation. I think if you're an effective fighting man or woman, you know how to innovate. I think ineffective fighting men and women are the individuals who cannot zigzag when they need to do so. It seems like you agree with that as well.
Totally, and what one of the key issues about being a soldier in any army, I think, is initiative. Not waiting for orders, being ready to seize the initiative when it presents itself. When you see an opportunity to get at the enemy, then you take that opportunity and get at the enemy. Sometimes it goes wrong, sometimes it goes right. But I think those people, those soldiers and commanders who understand that and are hungry to kill the enemy and destroy the enemy's equipment are the most successful ones in almost every situation you face.
So Richard, I want to give you an opportunity to speak a little bit before, and I'd like you to do it in brief form, even though I realize it's a seminal moment for you. A little bit about the Falklands War, if you would, because as I see, we've just had that all over the headlines again. Can you tell us the significance of that for people listening? And then I want to move on to Afghanistan.
The Falklands War, I mean, the Argentinians invaded the Falklands yesterday in 1982. And the Falklands War was one of the greatest frustrations in my whole life, because I wasn't allowed to fight in it. I was doing another job, and my unit didn't deploy, and I wasn't allowed to go either. And for any soldier who's serving in the forces and there's a war going on, you want to be in it. A lot of people who are not soldiers struggle to understand this, but the reality is you don't join the army unless you want to fight. Yeah, in some cases, soldiers who are conscripted, they don't necessarily want to fight. But if you join the army voluntarily, as I did, you want to fight. You're an aggressive sort of person, and you want to get stuck in to the country's enemies. So that was my frustration with the Falklands. But of course, it was a phenomenal success, made possible by Margaret Thatcher's leadership of this country, the second, or certainly one of the two greatest leaders that our country's ever seen, Winston Churchill, of course, being the other. I commented on Twitter this morning that or yesterday I think it was, that the first Sea Lord, the head of the Royal Navy, the day that the Argentinians invaded the Falklands, he put his uniform on. Normally they work in the military defence in civilian clothes. He put his uniform on, marched across the Downing Street, and persuaded Margaret Thatcher that we must invade, we must attack, because if we don't, we will wake up in a different country, which the word of which has no meaning at all. And I think that also goes back to the point we were talking about earlier on of military experience, because that man had Admiral Sir Henry Leach. He had been a naval officer in throughout the Second World War, and he was on board the warship that sank the Scharnhorst. So he'd experienced combat. He knew what could be achieved, and he wasn't frightened of trying to achieve it.
Mm. Well, I'm glad that you're able to speak to that, because I think that a great many people fail to understand that soldiers are bound for war, and they do draft, especially where there aren't the conscripted services. And you made that point very eloquently. Now,
I think the other thing I would, sorry to interrupt
please.
you, but I think the other point I would make on that is that soldiers don't want war. They want to fight if a fight is needed. They don't actually want war. And I think it was the American General Douglas MacArthur who said that soldiers above all abhor war because they experience it, they so often suffer from it, and they see the consequences. So I don't think soldiers on the whole are warmongers, but they are ready to fight when needed.
Yes, I do agree with that. And I said I was going to jump to Afghanistan, but you've raised a very important issue that I'd like to make our listeners aware of, and that is Winston Churchill, and more precisely, Winston Churchill's legacy, which is under attack in some corners over there in the United Kingdom. Do you have a view on that? Can you first of all describe the situation? I look at Winston Churchill as a man apart, quite honestly, in the annals of not only British but world history in the most favourable way. A great friend of Israel, a Zionist, as I understand it, and a hero, really, of Western civilization and beyond. And now that legacy is being chipped away at.
Yeah, it's like every great figure in our history is being attempted to be assassinated by the woke among us, the snowflakes, the people who want a virtue signal. Yes, of course he had his faults. We all have our faults, but he's been voted, I don't know over how many years, but frequently when there's a vote, who is the greatest Briton in this country, the top of the list is always Winston Churchill. And I do believe that it would have been very hard for us to win the war had Churchill not been Prime Minister. A lot of people say, well, Britain stood up against the Nazis. Well, Britain did, but the one person that ensured they did was Winston Churchill, when most of his cabinet and government and most politicians at the time wanted to appease Hitler. And he stood up against them and led the country to the defeat, alongside, obviously, our other allies, particularly the Americans, to destroy Hitler. And you mentioned he was a Zionist. He was certainly a Zionist, and he was heavily involved in the Balfour Declaration, which I think was, in political terms, one of the most significant steps taken in the recreation of the State of Israel. And he was absolutely horrified when the White Paper was introduced in 1939 that basically reneged on the Balfour Declaration and spoke out very strongly against that. So yeah, he's a very, very firm Zionist, as well as all his other great attributes.
Now, coming now to Afghanistan, I'm in possession, Richard, of a most remarkable book. Right? This book, of course, is authored by you, and it's called Attack States Red. And you kindly inscribed it. I'm very fortunate to have a collection of books that are inscribed by the author. And I'm just going to read the inscription there. It says, Sergeant Benjamin Anthony, with deepest respect from a British soldier to an Israeli soldier, keep attacking. Richard Kemp, February 2015, Tel Aviv. Now, I want to start, first of all, by recommending that people go and they read this book. But I'd like to ask you, because this is your motto and your mantra, keep attacking. You have it on your social media, you've written it in this book. Did you take that into Afghanistan, and was that mantra needed at the time that you found yourself in that theatre?
Good question. I would like to add to your accolades on that book that, particularly in these worrying times about coronavirus, when people are having problems sleeping, have a read of that. It'll send you straight off.
You said that. I didn't say that, Rich.
The reason I wrote that book actually is because I'd left the army by the time I wrote the book. But I went to a number of funerals of soldiers from my regiment, which is called the Royal Anglian Regiment, who were being killed in Afghanistan. And the complaint of soldiers who were attending the funeral, who were on leave or were back for some other purpose from the war that was going on, the only major complaint they had, it wasn't about the food's rubbish, we don't like being away from home, it's dangerous, none of that. The complaint was that back home here in the UK, people just do not understand what we're doing. They cannot get their heads around it. Not like in other wars where, First and Second World War, for example, where the population as a whole was locked into it, many of that experience. This was a very few soldiers involved in that war. And so I decided I wanted to write a book which was written in such a way, I hope it was written in such a way, as it puts the average member of the public who's never experienced war, never thought about war, actually into the boots of a British soldier. I wanted to help explain to them so that these people would not, or some of them, those who read the book, would not be disinterested or failing to understand. In terms of attacking, I mentioned earlier on when we spoke a short while ago, the offensive spirit that's so important in any military operation whatsoever, and that does include, I think, peacekeeping operations, because no peacekeeping operation takes place without a danger. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any need for troops to be there. So that danger has to be recognised and attacked. When I went to Afghanistan, it was actually in a relatively quiet period. It was in 2003. We hadn't seen anything like the rise of the Taliban that we saw later. Certainly, there were no troops, no British troops anyway, deployed to Helmand. And we had a relatively small force. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been commanding it. I was just a colonel. It was later commanded by a general when the troops increased. But nevertheless, I did keep attacking there. And there were people to attack. And if there weren't, I'd have found them anyway. But there were Al-Qaeda, there were other terrorist groups and gangs roaming around the place, trying to kill their opposite numbers or trying to kill NATO forces in Afghanistan or members of the Afghan government or the Afghan forces. And so I did everything I could, everything in my power, to focus British forces and with strong assistance from our American allies, focus them on getting intelligence and attacking these people who are trying to attack us. And it wasn't a kind of common thing that was going on at the time. People thought we're here to rebuild this country, we're here to re-establish democracy. But of course we were there to do those things, but primarily we were there to defeat terrorism. And so yes, it was necessary there, as I think it is in pretty much every other theatre of war.
Now remind me what year you said you deployed to Afghanistan.
I was there in 2003, the second half of 2003.
And you remained there for how long?
It was a 6-month tour. I was reluctant to come home, so I managed to squeeze it out to 7 months, something like that. But it was, as I said, it was a fantastic time, and there were two reasons for that really. One of which was as I mentioned, my boss was a long way away, and I could do a lot of what I wanted. And secondly, there were no rules at that time. When a theatre of operations stabilises and gets to be a long-term thing, more and more rules are introduced. I saw the same in the first Gulf War after we finished the fighting. And that people are desperate. They're desperate to get back to what they know, which is rules and regulations. But out there at that time, there were no rules, no regulations. So I could make it up to fit the situation we were in, which rules often don't do.
And you're fighting over there in asymmetrical situations. Can you give me an example of the fighting capabilities of the enemies and what sort of things you were encountering there?
At that time, the main kind of attacks that were going on were things like landmines being positioned as IEDs to blow up and kill soldiers, some of which happened during my time there. There were no British soldiers killed when I was there. There had been before. There were, of course, many, many afterwards. But there were some Canadian soldiers killed in the area that I was operating in, Kabul. So that was a tactic, a sort of relatively early form of the IED strategy that really blossomed and was responsible for killing so many of our troops. There were also, there were sniping attacks. There were various forms of gun attacks going on, explosive attacks of different sorts. And it was, but it was, I should stress that this was not a high intensity period of time. It wasn't fighting every single day. It was relatively rare that you get a military contact with the enemy, but it did happen from time to time. The Americans further in the south were very busy pursuing the remnants of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban around there. So they were doing a little bit more fighting than we were, but it was a relatively quiet time. We had to deal with other things like, one of our main roles was to retrain and to disarm militias and to retrain and re-roll them and help to train the Afghan army and the police. But one of the interesting situations I got involved in was an attempted coup d'etat against President Karzai, in which the British and other NATO forces were involved in containing that, and it actually, of course, didn't happen. But that again, that was a situation where had it actually been launched, then that could have resulted in a pretty big punch-up between ourselves and this renegade element of the Afghan army.
Now, what you said a moment ago about the purpose of this book and your desire to get the reader into the boots of the British soldier is so resonant with me, Richard, because in 2006, as you know, I was involved and engaged in the Second Lebanon War. And I remember as undertaking whatever it was that we needed to undertake, and the staunch criticism that came from the homeland, actually. Many, many Israelis criticizing it, critiquing it, commentators, politicians, you name it, they had something to say about it and its inefficacy. And I think time has shown that the Second Lebanon War, contrary to what most people think, and I was always of this mindset, incidentally, including right there in the theater, was a great success. Can the same be said about the campaign in Afghanistan? How do you measure that out?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, as a matter of fact. But I think we're looking. The President Trump is doing everything in his power to get the US forces out of Afghanistan now. And many people, of course, say we were defeated there. And of course, if the US forces withdraw, then the British forces will as well. We've both still got forces out there. The Americans, obviously, many more. But the same was true in the two wars that we fought in the 19th century in Afghanistan and the war we fought in the 20th century in Afghanistan. Many people brand all of those three wars as defeat. I would say that we won two of them and drew one of them because we achieved our objectives. And yes, it cost us a lot of lives, but it also cost the enemy even more lives. And that's true also, I think, of the war in Afghanistan. We're not necessarily counting body bags, but a lot of people talk about the number of US and British soldiers killed. Well, the kill rate among soldiers during my battalion's time, and not when I was serving there, but the battalion I wrote about in that book, was about 100 to 1. So for every British soldier killed, they'd have killed 100 of the enemy. And that is important, and it has an important effect on morale at home, but it wasn't being told. That story wasn't being told for fear of offending elements of the community over here, that we were out there killing lots of the enemy. So that was suppressed, and only our own soldiers were seen to come back in body bags, which of course depressed the British people. But our objective in going to Afghanistan in the first place in 2001, when the British forces deployed a little bit behind, but in that same year with the Americans, Royal Marines went out there. The objective was to to destroy Al Qaeda, defeat the Taliban, and kick them out, because they've been given the chance to, in the case of Taliban, given the chance to throw Al Qaeda out themselves and refused to do so. So that was the objective, and then the second objective was to unlike what a lot of people say, including people over here said, it's not to turn Afghanistan into Surrey in South Asia. It wasn't to give women rights. Of course, women should be given rights, and that would be a great outcome. But that wasn't what we were there for. We were there in the long term. We were there to stop another 9/11 or anything similar to that happening from Afghanistan, and we succeeded in doing that. There wasn't another 9/11 launched from Afghanistan. And the other factor, and so I would say in that respect it was a success. The other factor I think that people often don't recognize, that it enabled particularly President Obama to be extremely effective in his drone campaign against Al Qaeda and other terrorists in Pakistan, which, you know, Al Qaeda was just as focused on bringing down the Pakistani government as they were on bringing down the Afghan government. And the effect of having British forces or NATO forces, American forces in particular, in Afghanistan was to actually put the can on Al Qaeda, and it did very effectively. Not permanently, not something that can't be turned around, but at the time it suppressed them and prevented them from coming anywhere close to taking out the Afghanistan government. So I think I wouldn't write it off as a complete failure. I think my idea, and this is to an extent in hindsight, and I think most people probably agree with it now, is that what we should have really done was to go in there, hit them extremely hard, and then come out again, leaving whatever resources are necessary, whether it's air assets, intelligence, special forces, to deal with residual threats as they arose, which I think is what should be happening now when the US forces withdraw from Afghanistan. I do think that the one thing I would say is that there was immense courage shown by every single soldier, I think, who fought in Afghanistan. And you look at that book, Attack State Red, every page has the story of heroism on it. It was, I think, Admiral Nimitz, I think it was, that said, US Admiral Nimitz, that said of Iwo Jima, he said, uncommon valor was a common feature in the Iwo Jima campaign. I quote that in that book, and actually I agree with it.
So I want to turn now to a moment where I'm actually going to test your memory a little bit. And it is in reference to a television interview that I witnessed. I don't actually remember where I was when I saw it. I don't know how it was sent to me, or whether I was watching television or I got it emailed over to me. I really don't remember. But I'll never forget the way that it made me feel, because it was during Operation Cast Lead, and I believe. And Operation Cast Lead was Israel's defensive operation inside the Gaza Strip that was launched in 2008 and went into 2009. And there was a British colonel, and that British colonel was interviewed by the newscaster. And that British colonel, of course, was you, and you were brought on to speak about and provide analysis to do with the actions of the Israel Defense Forces in the Gaza Strip, who were facing allegations and accusations of disproportionality, genocide, ethnic cleansing, so on and so forth. There was really not a slander spared. And when I was watching it, and when it was sent to me, or if I did turn on the television, I remember looking at the colonel who was being interviewed, and I thought, great, there'll just be another senior ranked military officer who's going to turn around and join and pile on and put the boot in and really slander the members of the Israel Defense Forces. And suddenly he asks you for your opinion, and you respond with 1-2 sentences. Can you just speak those sentences, if you would, as you replied to the question about the ethos and actions of the Israel Defense Forces?
Well, even though I'm an extremely old man compared to you, my memory, I think, is better than yours, because it was a BBC interview in 2008 during Operation Cast Lead, as you said. And it wasn't a male interviewer, it was a female interviewer, just to correct you on that one.
Thank you.
And I was doing a lot of commentary and analysis for the BBC on Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. And so I was one of their favorite military so-called experts. And they called me in to talk about this horror story evolving in Gaza. And they expected me, exactly as you expected me, they expected me to follow their line, which was, of course, nothing other than absolutely raw criticism of Israel, which is pretty much what the BBC does all the time. And the question I was asked was, as a professional British officer, how can you must be extremely angry when you see that the IDF are going out deliberately killing innocent women and children. The question was something like that. And my answer was, I'm not angry, because that's not what's happening. The IDF is taking far greater steps than any other army in the history of warfare to save the lives of innocent civilians on the battlefield. That was the fact. And I've seen several other conflicts in Gaza since then, including the most recent violence going on the Gaza border. And that view that was made at that point has only been reinforced, even greater than it was then.
This is an incredible statement. And just to explain, for a Jew watching the BBC, when it comes to coverage of Israel, reporters are forgettable. But a friend coming through the airwaves, speaking in favor of the state of Israel and the soldiers of the IDF, that individual is never, ever forgotten. In fact, they're remembered forever. Now, it's a massive statement that you made there, the history of warfare. How did you know that? How did you know that no other military in the history of modern warfare, was it modern warfare or warfare period? I think it was modern warfare. You said,
warfare
right?
Period.
Warfare period. How did you know?
Well, first of all, I've obviously made a lifelong study, even when I was 5 years old, of military conflict, and been engaged in quite a few of them myself over the years. And actually, something you may not know is that the British Army, when I went through Sandhurst, which is our equivalent of West Point, to train to be an officer, the army that we focused on above all else to learn lessons from was the IDF. So I knew a lot about the IDF right from the first time I joined the army. And I then studied the IDF, and I met quite a number of IDF officers and soldiers over the years. And in fact, during my last job in the British Army, I was working in the Cabinet Office working on international terrorism intelligence. And I got some immense insights into the way, not just the IDF, but the entire government apparatus was dealing with this. And I was studying what was happening, and I was then able to look at the way that the IDF were operating in Gaza, and put it in the context of the way that we operate, the way the Americans operate. And from that, I made that statement, because it was what I absolutely believed to be the case. And I think one thing that often happens, and it's sometimes a deliberate strategy by the media, is to isolate Israel and its military operations and not in any way compare them to other people's military operations. One of the groups you mentioned earlier on that I'm involved with, the Friends of Israel Initiative, we've done some studies in recent years to using some of our the world's best experts, military experts in conflict, to place the IDF operation exactly in the context of what else is going on. And I would urge anybody listening to this to get on the Friends of Israel website and have a look at what we wrote about it. But it's an interesting thing to show you that I'm not completely crazy. I know you know I'm not, but to show other people who may be more skeptical, I'm not completely crazy and wasn't then. I was over in Israel immediately after one of the other conflicts, more recently than that, with a group of 13 former chiefs of staff of armies around the world, including Britain, the United States, Germany, and others. And we did a review of that conflict. And the greatest problem that they came out with at the end, none of them had any experience of being in Israel at all. But the greatest problem they identified was that our armies would not be able to match the standards set by the IDF in preserving the life of civilians on the battlefield. And also, General Dempsey, the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, made a similar comment, a similar statement to the media about that. So, although I'm often alone in my views, on this occasion I wasn't alone.
Yes, I've heard that from other sources as well, that other militaries would not be able to match the standard of the Israel Defense Forces when it comes to preserving the lives of innocents on the battlefield, but nor would any of those militaries fall prey to the vitriol and the invective and the slander and the delegitimization that the IDF faces. So I want to ask you a question. You're not of the Jewish faith, as far as I know, right? And and you're not a faith-based supporter, meaning you're not a member of the evangelical denomination. So let me ask you, where does this hatred come from, Richard? Is this anti-Semitism? Is this misinformation? What's the source of all of this?
That's a question that demands a lengthy answer, but I know you're wanting to keep this on track, so I'll try not to take too long about it. But yeah, I'm a Christian, but I wouldn't describe myself as a Christian Zionist. I'm a Christian and I'm a Zionist, but that's not my motivation for the stance I take on Israel. The simple reality of my position on Israel, that I know right from wrong. And if I see wrong being done, whether it's in the media, in the United Nations, or wherever else, in relation particularly to armed forces, and it obviously is most usually Israeli forces, I feel that I need, where I think it's wrong, I feel I need to do what I can to actually try and correct the slander and abuse. Where it comes from, there's a long campaign by Arab countries and Arab groups in the Middle East to delegitimize Israel. They never accept Israel. They will never, in my view, accept Israel. Religiously, they're not really allowed to accept Israel because they see that territory as being a territory that once upon a time belonged to Muslims, in other words, to the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. And it can never, ever be left for non-Muslims. So they have to, religiously, they have to attack and stop it from happening. Now, there are obviously tactical pauses, and things like the peace treaty with Egypt and with Jordan are an example of, real politics rather than what they really do believe, I think. But it begins there, and it began really back soon after the Balfour Declaration, when that was resisted wholeheartedly by Arabs all the way through, and has continuously been done right up to date. And they, of course, have managed to get many of the West on side with it. In fact, the opposition from the Arabs to the creation of a Jewish homeland, recreation of a Jewish homeland in Israel, was due entirely to the pressure from the Arabs. And but those in the West have got on the bandwagon for various different reasons. One is anti-Semitism, of course, as you say, and that's probably quite a significant reason, but not the only one. Another one is because I was taught when I was at school, I was taught by the media, not at home, but I was taught throughout my entire life to be ashamed to be British because of our dreadful imperial past. And that's got a lot to do with it, because they see that we must, in all circumstances, no matter what, side with those people that we once dominated in imperial terms. And that means the Arabs and not the state of Israel. So that's another rationalization for another reason for it. There are many others, one of which is, in most of the West, most of Europe, there are large Islamic populations, and many members, I'd say the overwhelming majority of most Islamic populations, are brought up to despise the state of Israel. And our politicians want their votes. And so, of course, one of the best ways of getting their votes is to certainly not befriend Israel, and if possible, be strongly critical of Israel. And I think that's another reason. And there are other things, the Jewish state, that's anathema to so many woke people, so many left-wing politically correct people. It's anathema because they don't believe in religion, and they certainly don't believe there should be a religious state. And so it must be attacked. Of course, they, when they look at various Islamic states around the world, that's not a problem for the kind of imperial reasons I mentioned.
Now, coming back to Israel, you and I stood there in 2014. Again, we met up in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge, just before I was drafted. If you remember, I was drafted into my reserve brigade at that time. But before that, you wanted to go down to the front line. I actually think, had it been something we could have facilitated, you would have almost crossed into the Gaza Strip and done a walkabout there. Obviously, we weren't able to get you there, but we were able to go together right down to the front. entry point for the soldiers who were massing on the border. Again, a defensive operation into the Gaza Strip. Why is that so important to you? Why do you take up your time, your talents, your abilities, and fly over to the States of Israel? And when, frankly, many people are leaving when rockets are being fired, you turn up and you show up and you want to get as close to the soldiers as you possibly can. What's that about?
Well, if you remember, if your memory serves you correctly, when you got mobilized to go to the reserve, I begged you to take me with you so I could join the IDF for the fight. But you recognised I was a fat old British broken down soldier, and I would be more trouble than I was worth. But no, I think, you know, I by that time I had become heavily involved in commenting on what was happening in Israel. And I believe, you know, they say time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. If you're going to really understand a situation, you've got to see it as close up as you possibly can. And you took me down there to that border on that occasion, and we saw a great deal of activity. We saw a lot going on there, and I was able to form a very, very, I think, accurate judgment of what was happening as a result of that visit, and talking, you know, person to person, talking to private soldiers, NCOs, officers, even the chief of the staff of the Israeli army, and was able to form my opinion for that reason. So, you know, and why is it so important to me? Well, because not only I hate to see any country, any democracy like Israel maligned in that way, but also I recognize that we're fighting the same war. Britain and Israel, the United States, we're fighting the same war. We're fighting the same type of enemy, and we need to be standing alongside each other. And Jose Maria Aznar, who was the former president of Spain and the chairman of this Friends of Israel group previously, is now Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada. He was famously quoted as saying, "If Israel goes down, we all go down," and I think he's absolutely right in that. So to me, I spent my entire life fighting for this country and for our allies, and I consider it to be a part of that fight, albeit maybe from a wheelchair and grey hair with a large gut on me.
Now, before I go any further, I just want to say something to the listeners and to the viewers. Before we began this conversation, you said that if I wanted to, I could take you beyond the hour for another 15 minutes or so. Do I still have your permission to go beyond the hour?
Yeah, of course you do.
Yeah, thank you.
Benjamin, as you know, I love the sound of my own voice. So I'm happy to talk for 3 or 4 hours if you want.
Wonderful. Well, we're very much enjoying it. I'm absolutely certain everyone else is, and there's just so much to get to. So I'm going to, so that everybody knows and is aware of it, I'm going to run this conversation inclusive of audience questions to 1 hour, 15 minutes, 1 hour, 15 minutes, as opposed to the 1 hour, if that's okay. And thank you for being so gracious with your time. But as you're speaking, questions come to mind. And one of those questions is, how good are we as a defense force over in Israel? You know, Jewish citizens of other states have known generation after generation absent a fighting force and absent a defensive force. And so it's natural that we would regale the achievements of the Israel Defense Forces and that we would bask in those achievements. How good are we as a military, as a defense force, in your estimation?
I mean, I would say one thing before I give you my view, which is that if you ask most British soldiers, I assume it's the same now, it certainly was when I was serving, what they're three, obviously the British Army is by far the best army in the world. Of course, that goes, I'm sure everyone agrees with that.
Richard, we're losing you.
Have you got me back now?
Your reception's become very spotty all of a sudden. I'm only joking, Richard, because of what you're saying about the British.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it past you pulling the plug. But you know, we obviously believe we're the best, but so does everyone in the US Army and so on. But if you ask a British soldier, apart from the British Army, what would be the 3 armies that you have most respect for? There would be the French Foreign Legion. Don't ask me why. You know, the French are our natural enemies, but nevertheless. The US Marine Corps, which I can certainly back up, having served alongside the US Marines on several occasions, and the IDF. The IDF is enormously respected in the British Army among certainly most people that I've met serving and retired. But my view is that before I talk about the professionalism of the IDF, I think it's important to say that one of the most important aspects of military operation defense combat is apart from those people who fight it and their preparedness to do so, is the political will and the support they get. And you know, I think Israel has demonstrated over many years, and you can look at things like the Entebbe operation, you can look at the 1967 war, the 1948 war, when Field Marshal Montgomery, the head of the British Army at the time, predicted that Israel would be defeated in 1948 within a matter of weeks. You know, you look at all that stuff, and it's their fighting spirit, but also it's their tenacity and the determination of their political leaders, and I think that's always been very strong in Israel. And yes, I know people have criticised Prime Minister Netanyahu over the Gaza campaigns and not pressing it home to the end. But of course, there are many, many reasons why that's happened, which I won't go into now. So that political will, that determination by our leaders, enables an army to be able to operate the way that it has to operate. And I think we're turning to the quality of the IDF. It's a ragtag army. You see, you know, people will see the IDF at checkpoints and things, and maybe a British soldier might see it and think, bloody hell, these guys look a bit scruffy and laid back, etc. But that's the Israeli way. And in my view, having got to know them particularly, it doesn't in any way reflect on their capabilities as soldiers. It's more of a presentational thing. But also, why wouldn't they be a bit like that? Because they're all conscripts, or virtually all, many of them conscripts. And that you can't handle a conscript army as you can handle a regular army. You simply can't. Mm-hmm. We didn't in the British Army when we conscripted people in the First and Second World Wars and afterwards. So it's a very different beast. It's also been constantly fighting throughout its entire existence, right the way from 1948 and before that even, and right up to today. So it's a battle-hardened army. Yes, people have turned over. Most of them are young men and women of sort of 18, 19, 20, etc. But nevertheless, they've got that spirit, and they've got the tradition of fighting. And I think they are very effective. My only criticism, I think, I would make of them, and I've got plenty of criticism, but a lot of minor detail stuff, is that a junior leader in the IDF is somebody who has served for a very short space of time. To be a sergeant, I think, you have to do a year or something like that, maybe 18 months. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. To be a sergeant in the British Army, the equivalent rank, actually, pretty much, you've got to probably have served about 15 years. You've got to have, in some good cases, maybe less, you've got to have undergone a lot of very tough and demanding career courses and selection to get there. So you end up with a completely different type of leader at the junior levels. I think when you get up to the senior ranks and more senior ranks than the officers, the differences are much less, because mostly the officers are professional, if not all of them. So I think that's a significant difference. But again, you know, one of the things I think that the IDF has, which I think the British Army has got now as well, a bit later on, is the issue of individual initiative by soldiers who think for themselves. I know Benjamin Netanyahu has often said that, you know, I have 7 million prime ministers in this country or something like that. Well, the same is true in the army. You've got however many thousands of generals in the army. And I think that's a plus in many ways. And I remember being struck when I was reading an article about the IDF when I was still serving, that one of the questions that's asked on the confidential report that the annual report on a soldier or a commander, is how willing is this person to question the orders given to him? And if that had been a question on a British Army report at the time, it probably would have been, if they said he's very willing to question, it would probably be a negative. In the IDF, it was deemed to be a positive, and I think that is extremely important, because any commander knows, or most commanders know, that he's not the only one with brains. He's not the only one that knows things, that can see things, that has experience. There are so many people he can draw on. One of the things I used to do when I was a company commander, particularly, and also to an extent a battalion commander, was if I had, obviously it depends on time, it depends what you're trying to do, it depends on how quickly you've got to get something done. When I possibly could, before I made a plan, I would consult with more junior people right the way down to corporal level, which is the lowest sort of commander in the British Army. And often in drawing up my plans as a result, that they were hugely benefited by the insights given by some of the most junior people, and they were saying things that I hadn't really thought about. And so I think that that's a common characteristic in the IDF.
So Richard, I'm going to move to the audience questions, but before I do, actually, there's one other issue I want you to weigh in on, and I'd like you to do it in brief form, though it is a very far-ranging subject. Jeremy Corbyn could have been the Prime Minister of Great Britain. What accounts for the support that he did enjoy, it seems, right up until the very end when everything collapsed? And should everybody be concerned, or should we look at that and wish it away and not pay too much attention to the Corbyn phenomenon that occurred? And again, I know it's a large subject, but I do want you to comment on it, at least briefly, if you would.
Well,
and please speak to the anti-Semitism there as well, if you.
I mean, Corbyn is a renowned anti-Semite. He's appeared on the front of every Jewish newspaper in the UK accused of anti-Semitism. A lot of people very clearly level that criticism at him, and it's a fact. He is an anti-Semite, both in terms of his distaste, I think, for Jews, and also his hatred of the state of Israel. And in my book, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's one and the same thing. So, there's no doubt about his feelings there. He spent a great deal of his life doing everything he can to criticize and find fault and undermine the state of Israel and support terrorists who are trying to kill Israelis. In the same way as he also supported terrorists who were trying to kill British soldiers in Northern Ireland. He was a renowned supporter of the IRA. But that wasn't the question. I think the level of support he enjoyed was because of the party he was leading, which he helped shape, but was shaped before that as well, which obviously is on the left. And as I sort of touched on earlier, the tendency of people on the left, not all by any means, not all at all, but the tendency is towards being anti-Israel. And going back also to and a lot of his supporters were young people. And they get their minds, I think, and maybe criticised for saying this, but don't really care. But they get their minds distorted at universities by hard left university lecturers, and even at high schools. And they were among his most fervent supporters. I'm sure that many of them, when they get older, will grow out of that, but they hadn't grown out of it when they signed up to support him. So he enjoyed a strong support on the left, but it wasn't without criticism. It's from his own party. Many people left his party because of what he was. But I think the one thing that I think is extremely important to know and recognise is that he was absolutely annihilated in our general election last year. He was destroyed. He led his party to the worst defeat they've ever had in their history wasn't just because of his anti-Semitism, it was also because of many other things. But I think a lot of it was the anti-Semitism, and I think it showed, and I think it's encouraging to see, that the overwhelming majority of the British public rejected an anti-Semitic leader at that election. And I think that the Labour Party now will find it very, very hard to recover from that massive blow that he was dealt by the British public.
Yeah, they got an incredible drabbing at the polling booth, and I'm very pleased that they did. I would just come back with one comment from my estimation from viewing it from afar. I actually don't think that Corbyn was repudiated because of his anti-Semitism. I don't think the British electorate came out to repudiate anti-Semitism. I think they came out and repudiated the party and him because of a totally incoherent Brexit policy, number one, completely incoherent, if you remember, and also just a socialist platform that he put forward that even his own typical party members were unable to trust the veracity or the opportunity for that to actually come to pass. And I think that's something that a lot of British Jews felt, but I certainly respect your very, very strong and forthright condemnation, frankly, of Corbyn, and I appreciate it. And I remember you speaking out about it before the result was in. So thank you again for your tremendous friendship.
I would just say I don't disagree with those comments you made, but as I said when I started talking there, I said that there were many other reasons why he was defeated, but I am also personally of the view that his anti-Semitism played a significant part in it.
I hope you're right, and I would prefer that I be wrong in this case. So let's go to a couple of questions. There you have it. Let's have a couple of questions here. This is from a veteran of the United States Army, and he goes back. Now we're going to try and keep these brief just because of timing. He asks, what would you have done? I'm assuming he's referring to Afghanistan, with another 50,000 troops or $1 billion or one more year. Would it have made a difference to the outcome in Afghanistan? And I'm again assuming he's talking about Afghanistan now.
Well, I think more troops when you're fighting a war and more money to fight it is obviously going to make a significant difference, particularly something like 50,000 more troops. And the British Army in Afghanistan fought with far, far fewer troops. And the same was true in Iraq, far fewer troops than we needed. Absolutely. We're a tiny country. We have a relatively small army. And we weren't prepared to commit the numbers that were needed to that fight. And it comes back again down to political will. And I think that the political will in this country helped to lead to, let's say, less than full success in Afghanistan. But the other thing, I think, the other important factor that I consider to be the case is that we were, and it is also related to political will, is that we were fighting the wrong war at some points and tying our hands behind our back in doing so. And I think we placed far too much emphasis a lot of the time on hearts and minds of the civilian population. That was, and if you remember General McChrystal, I think it was, who brought in what he called courageous restraint, which was about that. Mm-hmm. And that was, of course, adopted by the British Army, which is doing that anyway. But where you let an enemy go rather than risk killing a civilian in the process, not just one enemy, maybe many enemies. You don't necessarily fight back when you're being attacked because it might risk killing civilians. Now, of course, not only morally and professionally, but also legally, we obviously don't want to kill any more civilians than we absolutely have to. But the law does. The laws of armed conflict do allow us to kill civilians when it's necessary to achieve our military objectives, as long as it is proportionate to those objectives. And I think we lost sight of that. And we were so reluctant to risk the lives of innocent civilians, which actually turned its back on us, because we thought that by focusing on hearts and minds, we would get the support of the local people, which in some circumstances you would. In Northern Ireland, it certainly helped us. But I think in a country like Afghanistan, the local people, they look at, I hate to quote Osama bin Laden, but he said, people will look at a strong horse and a weak horse, and they'll prefer the strong horse. And that was the same of the Afghan civilian population. They would look at the way that the Taliban were ruthless, vicious, merciless, killing whoever they wanted, their own populations, etc. And the Allied forces, who were obviously very different, and they would see the enemy getting away with things that they shouldn't have been getting away with. And they're looking at it from a self-interested point of view. And therefore they think the ones going to come out on top here are the Taliban, not the British or American forces. And so we will not be supporting the losers in this, because if we support the losers, then when the victors win it, we're going to have our heads chopped off. So I think that to me it was a major issue that we faced in Afghanistan and also in Iraq.
Question here from Ethan, and he asks, do you think there's a future for Jewish communities outside Israel in places like the US and the UK?
Well, I certainly hope so, because we all need our Jews in these countries. The Jewish communities in I think most Western countries contribute to those countries, to their economies, to their innovation, to their development, far, far more than their numbers would suggest they do. So I think if those communities disappeared, and I know that many of them are fleeing from France and some from the UK as well, I think the countries concerned will be at a great disadvantage because of it, and morally, of course, as well. We're a long way from the Holocaust, but it's frightening the extent to which some of the mantras of the Holocaust are being repeated in this day and age. But I do see the situation in the West getting more and more difficult as we progress, and I do unfortunately see the loss of the Jewish community, or some of them, not I hope all of them. I do see these numbers continuing to increase. I think a lot of Jews, going back to what we spoke about before, a hell of a lot of Jews were getting ready to go if Corbyn had become prime minister. And so, of course, the real answer to the question depends to a very large extent on what the politicians in these countries do, and to the extent to which they're prepared to support the Jews in their country and defend them.
There's a question here from Amiad in Israel, and he asks, to what extent does the world's critical view and media affect the army's willingness and ability to wage war effectively, both in Israel and other Western militaries?
I think it's obviously going to have an effect on morale, and I think that was one of the issues that we saw in Vietnam. Was the debilitating effect on morale of troops of the lack of support they had back home, certainly towards the end of that war. And so it does have an effect. And I think it sort of also touches on the reason I wrote that book, Attack State Red, was because, if the soldiers don't have the support of people back home, it's troubling to them. It is troubling to them. And, when I was, for example, in the first Gulf War, it was a short, sharp conflict. We were inundated beyond possible use of gifts and parcels and food and presents from Britain. And that has, even if it's over the top, it has a phenomenal effect on morale, knowing that the people back home actually care about them and back what they're doing. And I think, the opposite, a lack of support. I think, military organizations, particularly the British Army, the American Army, and probably the Israeli Army as well, or definitely the Israeli Army as well, they are able to fight on and to maintain their morale, irrespective of what's going on back home, to an extent. And I think, depending how long it goes on for, how strong the opposition is in the homeland. But I think it's important. But I talked, I've spoken many times to Israeli soldiers. I spoke to some Israeli soldiers on the border of Gaza very recently, when the violence was going on there a few months back. Yes. And I asked them about this, and I said, what does it feel like? You're exposing yourself to danger. You're in range of sniper fire. Some Israeli soldiers were killed. You're working around the clock, and you go back and watch television. You see these idiots around the world saying you're a baby killer, and they basically shrugged. We're used to it, and I think that's fair enough, really, in a way. I would certainly tell any Israeli soldiers that are listening not to care a damn about what's being said about them in the Western press. The most important thing, obviously, for them is that they're supported at home.
Now, the last two questions that I want to ask you, the first one comes from Jim, and he asks, what do you see as the greatest threat to civilization across the coming 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's
a nice short answer there. Is it perfectly teed up by way of that question, I'm sure. Richard.
Have you got an hour? I'll restrict it to military threats rather than civilizational threats, which obviously are far and wide. I would say the greatest military threats we face, which obviously a military threat is also a threat to the whole country, otherwise there would be no point in the military fighting. But there are probably 4 major threats that face us at the moment in the West. The first is not necessarily in order of priority. The first is Islamic Jihad, Sunni Islamic Jihad, which has been attacking us for years and years and years, and is relentless at doing so, and will continue doing so. And that's including our forces overseas, and it includes terrorist organizations back here at home, some of which are organized and sent in by groups like the Islamic State itself and Al-Qaeda and so on. So I think that is a very serious threat, which we are obviously doing our best to contain in this country, and of course in the US, by both fighting it where we find it, going out to the countries where they represent a threat to us and dealing with that threat if we can, like Afghanistan and Iraq. In large number of cases in Britain, I'm sure the same is true of America, sending troops out to go and help the local forces, to help them to train, to help them know how to fight and things like that. And of course, our security services back home are working around the clock to deal with that threat and being, on the whole, very effective against it. The second threat is Iran, Shia jihad. And Iran, I would say Iran is one of the most dangerous countries in the world, particularly today, particularly at this very moment, where they are looking, we know they're looking very carefully at trying to exploit this coronavirus situation and carry out attacks against particularly US forces in the Middle East, and no doubt attacks elsewhere as well. I think it's an extremely serious situation. And I do believe that most of us are inclined to think, well, if there's this terrible disease going on, we must let up on our enemies. We must not let up on our enemies, because we can be sure of one thing: they won't let up on us. The Iranian regime is under great threat right now, and it was under great threat before the coronavirus began. And they will do everything they can. It's their overriding priority is to protect that regime. They will do whatever they can, if it includes lashing out in a very, very big way against the US to precipitate a conflict, which will, they hope, as historically has proven sometimes does, get support back home. I think they will do that. The third, and I don't need to elaborate much on this, is China. We have been in a Cold War with China for many years now. They've been fighting the Cold War. We have not been fighting the Cold War. We've refused to recognize it exists. And we've allowed China, with its horrific government, its oppressive, murderous dictatorship, we've allowed them to spread their empire around the world. And it's not a geographical empire in terms of land they occupy. It's an economic empire. It's buying up, influencing, and things like they're doing now. It's a smaller level of it, but sending out aid to countries that need it to help them fight coronavirus. That's not because the Chinese are doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They see that as an aggressive diplomacy to gain influence and gain control in our countries. And I think it's now time that we fought that Cold War. And I would hope that one of the major results of this terrible situation we're in now is to reset relationships between Western countries and China, and not only do our best to prevent them having influence in our countries, like, for example, the ridiculous decision taken by the government to allow Huawei, the Chinese telecoms company, to form a part of our 5G network, which was an absurd decision. Now, I hope that will be done to the British government. Sorry? The
British government's decision.
The British government, yeah. And I think, also we should be pushing them back around the world, wherever they put, like we did with the communist Russians in the Cold War. We should push them back, because otherwise they will take over. And we don't want that. We don't want to be overly influenced, unduly influenced by a vicious, ruthless dictatorship like China. And the fourth and final one, Russia. Russia, I think, I've got a lot of respect and admiration for Russia as a country, as I have for the other countries I've mentioned, of course. But one thing we know is that President Putin is determined to rebuild as best he can, to rebuild the Soviet Union. And a major way of doing that is to oppose the West. And so he also, in different ways, is fighting against the West, particularly the United States of America. It accounts partly for why he's in Syria. It also accounts for the poisoning of the attempt to poison and kill Sergei Skripal here in the UK in recent months.
So before I come to the final question, I just have to say that I'm deeply concerned about what's going on with COVID-19. You in terms of your military background, just whether it be a bioweapon or not, it doesn't matter. The fact is that it's caused massive disruption to the world as we know it. And it's put everybody on this dependency for distance and commuting, working from home, and so on and so forth. All you need now is a cyber attack to come and hit the infrastructure of the West, and you recalibrate the economic reality of the world, probably for the near and middle term. So I very much appreciate you bringing forward your views on China. My last question, if you could, and I actually don't want you to speak to it for too long, Richard, but there's a reason I'm asking. It comes from Leeds in England, where I was born and raised, and it comes from a friend named Marcus, and he says, what do you think of the new state solution as proposed by our organization?
Yeah.
So the New State solution calls for an independent state in Gaza with contiguity into the Sinai Peninsula. I don't want you to talk about it for too long, but it would be remiss of me not to ask Marcus this question.
It would indeed. But just before I do that, on the coronavirus, it's a terrible situation we're in. Absolutely terrible. Whatever the cause of it was, it's awful. But I happen to believe that yes, there will be a lot more deaths, and it will be devastating for our countries. But I happen to believe that we will get back from that, and I think very quickly we'll get back from that. And we will have learned a lot of lessons from it. And I think, yeah, you're right to say that there are other threats like cyber compounding coronavirus, which is what I meant really when I was saying, I wasn't referring specifically to cyber, but when I was saying that, our enemies won't let up on us, and that's true. The answer to your question about the New State solution, I think it's an incredibly creative attempt to resolve the impasse that has existed since 1948 and before that, even in the Middle East. And I think it's, to my mind, it provides the ideal solution. It's practical, it works, it can be imposed, whatever anybody else thinks, and it would result, I think, in a very stable situation. I'm not saying stable in terms of being free of terrorism and attacks and things, but a stable political situation for Israel in many ways. I think actually there's a strong likelihood that eventually something like your new, and I'd like to also pay tribute to you, because I know you were instrumental, along with a number of other experts, in putting this proposal forward and refining it. I do think it could well be, there could well be an ultimate solution along similar lines to that. I do also believe that the Trump peace proposals are very good. I think that depending on how the political situation works out in Israel and how much power Prime Minister Netanyahu has to let's say, to reassert sovereignty over certain key areas of Judea and Samaria, and also the Jordan Valley, I think it could result in a vastly improved situation for Israel in that way and in other ways. And I think one of the things that we've seen to an extent, and we may see more of, is almost a reset of, at least in some areas, of global view towards Israel, because they've seen, the world has seen Israel basically condemned by America all of the time, although America is Israel's firmest supporter, condemned by the Arab countries, condemned by the West. And now what they're seeing is the President Trump peace proposals being, broadly speaking, with relative degrees of enthusiasm, supported by the Arabs, supported, of course, by the US, and rejected by the Palestinians, which shows people, I think, where the real problem lies. So I don't believe for one moment that it will result in peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I don't think that was necessarily the objective of it. I think what the objective of that process was, and I would fully support that objective, is to put Israel into a more advantageous position than it's in at present. And I think President Trump was keen to do that because he recognizes that he, or people with minds like him, will not always be in the White House. And when we get a more left-leaning government in the White House, which will eventually happen, Israel will not enjoy the kind of support that it's enjoyed certainly in recent years. So I fully support your New State solution. I don't think it's going to happen immediately. I think it could happen in the future. But I also feel that maybe even along the way towards that, the current peace proposals are going to be valuable for Israel, but not resulting in peace.
Well, Richard, Colonel Kemp, I'm so very grateful to you for your time. We've gone over the time. You couldn't have been more gracious, but I want our listeners and our viewers to understand why. It's because you're a gem and a jewel to the Jewish people, to the state of Israel, to the people of Israel, wherever they are. You are a rare individual indeed, who has come at precisely the right moment, with the right experience and expertise to defend us against the onslaught that we do absorb from the international community regularly and often. And so when occasion comes to pass for a long form conversation with someone like you, it would be an error indeed to pass up on that opportunity or to curtail it because of what would be standard time constraints. They're not at play today, because of the circumstances that we have. And so I wanted to really flesh out a number of issues with you. I'm very grateful and feel very honored to have had the opportunity to talk to you. We are very thankful to you, and on behalf of Rosita Panini and my great and powerful colleague Alan Langer, and everybody who's on this call and watching and listening, please just accept our sincere thanks. And we hope that the people of Great Britain, of Israel, of the United States, and of course the world over are soon freed of the tyranny of this dreadful, dreadful virus. I'm sure that they will be, and that these troubles, which have come, will certainly be troubles that will pass. Thank you so very much, Colonel. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. If you wouldn't mind, I'm sure the viewers and listeners would be happy to listen to you praising me for another few minutes. So if you could carry on with that, it'd be fantastic.
We'll start the next conversation there. Thank you very much, Colonel. Over and out.
Over and out.